Lien sat in his small, cluttered shop, elbows resting on the desk, eyes half-lidded. The ticking of the clocks on the walls filled the air like an orchestra of monotony, each second a reminder of the mundane grind that had defined his life for as long as he could remember. The time merchant's business was rarely thrilling, but it was steady. He sold memories, moments frozen in time, and offered people the chance to relive, pause, or even change the way they experienced certain memories. A bit of nostalgia here, a moment of regret there, a few fractured glimpses of joy or sorrow. Lien had perfected the art of trading in the ephemeral, the intangible, but right now, he didn't care about selling memories. He didn't care about the time-traveling tourists who wandered in and out of his shop. Lien was tired, exhausted, even, and he needed a break. His eyes flickered to the small, inconspicuous button hidden underneath the corner of his desk, worn from years of use. He had placed it there himself, after all, a device to solve his particular problem, how to keep going when you had simply run out of steam. That he pressed it, instantly, everything stopped, the ticking of the clock ceased, the hum of the city outside the shop went silent, and the cars on the street froze mid-motion. A pigeon, wings half fluttered, was suspended in the air, as if caught in a moment of time that had no end. Even the dust motes floating lazily in the beam of light from the window were paused, frozen in place. Lien leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms and letting out a deep breath. This was his ritual, a moment of silence, a few precious seconds when he could simply be without the weight of the world pushing against him. No expectations. No customers. Just the stillness of a universe held in limbo by his own little invention. Ah, peace, Lien muttered to himself, closing his eyes. This is what I needed. He allowed himself a full minute, no more. Time was too precious, even for him. With a satisfied exhale, he pressed the button again. The world snapped back into motion, cars honked, people walked down the street, and the ticking of clocks resumed its usual rhythm. Lien let out a small yawn and reached for his cup of tea, knowing the world had been on pause for just enough time to allow him to recover. A few seconds to gather his energy. A few seconds to reset. But as he settled into his chair, content, a voice from the doorway startled him. "You've got to be kidding me." Lien whipped around to see a figure standing in the doorway, arms crossed and a scowl on his ancient face. His clothes were simple but well-worn, his long silver beard falling to his chest like a relic from another age. His eyes, sharp and knowing, glared at Lien like a teacher catching a student with his hand in the cookie jar. Lien sighed, recognizing the figure immediately. It was Grandfather Chi, a man who claimed to be over 1,000 years old and, despite the wild claim, somehow managed to maintain a certain unsettling aura of truth around him. Chi was one of those people who just knew things about time, about life, about the universe. And while Lien didn't believe in most of the strange, philosophical nonsense Chi liked to spout, he also couldn't deny that Chi had a way of getting under his skin. "What's the matter, Chi?" Lien asked, leaning back in his chair and setting his tea aside. "I'm taking a break. The world doesn't move in real time for everyone, you know." Chi stepped forward, his expression stern. "That's the problem, Lien. Time doesn't work like that. It's not yours to control." Lien raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And you're the authority on time, now? You've been watching me for, how long now?" Chi's lips tightened into a thin line. "Long enough to know that you're doing something dangerous." Lien rolled his eyes and leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. "Dangerous? It's just a few seconds. What harm can a pause do? The world keeps turning, and I'm just giving it a little break when I need one." Chi shook his head. "You're locking time in place. Do you even realize what you're doing?" Lien looked at him quizzically. "What I'm doing? I'm taking a nap. I'm resting. How does that affect anything?" Chi didn't respond right away. He walked around the room, running his fingers over the various trinkets and oddities that lined the shelves. The small, shimmering hourglasses, the strange clocks that ticked backward, and the floating time orbs, each item representing a moment or a slice of history captured in time. Qi's gaze softened for just a moment before he turned back to Lien. Every time you pause the world, every time you stop time, you disturb the natural flow of things. Time is meant to flow, to move. But you found a way to lock it in place, and I fear that you don't understand the consequences. Lien smirked, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. I've been doing this for months now, Qi. And I'm still here. The world keeps going. No big consequences. It's just a little pause, like pressing the pause button on a video game. Qi's eyes narrowed. What you're doing is worse than pressing pause on a game. You're creating a break in time itself. When you stop time, the world doesn't just pause, it builds up. All the moments that should be happening, the seconds that should be passing, they pile up. You think you're giving yourself a break, but in reality, you're creating an imbalance. And eventually, that imbalance will catch up with you. Lien shrugged. And if it does? I'll fix it. Besides, I'm not doing anything that's going to bring the whole world crashing down. Qi took a deep breath, stepping closer to Lien. I'm afraid you're wrong. The longer you use that lock, the worse it will get. And I've come to stop you before it's too late. Lien raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. Oh? And how exactly do you plan on doing that? I'm going to destroy it, Qi said simply, his gaze locking with Lien's. I'm going to destroy the time lock. If I can't stop you from using it, then I'll make sure it can't be used again. Lien blinked. You think you can just destroy it? It's not that simple. The time lock is, well, it's mine. I've built it myself. Qi nodded slowly, his gaze flickering with something unreadable. That's exactly why I'm afraid of it. Qi's plan was clear, but Lien wasn't about to let go of his invention that easily. The time lock had become a part of his life. It was his safety net, his secret weapon for the exhaustion that came with his work. Every few hours, when the fatigue grew unbearable, Lien would activate the lock, let the world freeze for a few seconds, and let his mind and body recover. It was a simple system, and it worked. But Qi's warning had started to gnaw at him. The old man wasn't stupid. What if there was something to what he was saying? What if the time lock was doing something that couldn't be easily undone? You're really serious about this, aren't you? Lien said, standing up and looking Qi dead in the eye. What if you destroy it? What happens then? Qi didn't flinch. The natural flow of time will resume. The backlog will be cleared. The imbalance you've created will be corrected, and everything will be as it should be. Lien felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't so sure about this whole backlog business, but the way Qi spoke made it sound like something much worse than a few missed seconds. And as much as he hated to admit it, the idea of being caught in the middle of some cosmic error had its appeal. Was he really willing to risk the stability of the world for a few seconds of comfort? Fine, Lien said after a long pause, crossing his arms. Let's see what happens if you try to destroy it. But you'd better be ready for the consequences, Qi. Qi's eyes softened, a hint of something sad passing over his features. I've lived with consequences for 1,000 years, Lien. I'm ready for whatever comes next. The tension in the room thickened. Lien's fingers itched at the desk, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure what the next move should be. Lien stood frozen, staring at Qi. The old man's resolve was clear, unwavering, and it gnawed at Lien in a way he couldn't quite explain. Qi wasn't just some eccentric old man spouting nonsense. He was serious, and something about his eyes, something about the way he spoke, convinced Lien that perhaps, for the first time, he wasn't the one in control of the situation. For years, Lien had prided himself on being able to bend time to his will. A few seconds of pause, a few seconds of rest when he needed it, no harm done. But now, with Chi standing there, his words hanging in the air like an invisible weight, Lien couldn't shake the feeling that he had done something deep and dangerous. Maybe it wasn't as harmless as he had always believed. "I don't get it," Lien said finally, the words slipping out almost without thinking. "Why can't I just take my breaks without you making this a big deal? Time's mine to manage, right?" Chi's gaze softened ever so slightly, and Lien could see the weariness that lingered beneath the old man's sharp exterior. "It's not yours to manage, Lien. You can't control something as big as time without consequences. And the problem with you," he continued, "is that you don't understand the force of what you're playing with. You think you're just pressing a button. You think it's harmless. But every pause, every break, adds up." Lien sighed. He'd heard all this before. It was the same old argument about balance, flow, and the natural course of things that Chi was so obsessed with. "Okay, let's say I agree with you," Lien said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "What's your big plan, then? You're going to walk in here, destroy the time lock, and suddenly everything's back to normal? You've never even used it, Chi. How can you understand what it does?" Chi's eyes flashed with something Lien couldn't quite place, perhaps frustration, or maybe something more like resignation. He took a step forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Because I've seen what happens when time is abused, Lien. I've seen it in ways you couldn't possibly comprehend. You're not just affecting yourself. You're affecting everyone around you, even if you don't see it. Time doesn't just stop. It piles up. Every moment you pause builds a ripple in reality. And eventually, those ripples catch up with you." Lien felt his stomach tighten. He didn't want to believe Chi, didn't want to accept that something so simple could be so dangerous, but the old man's words were starting to make him uncomfortable. What if he was right? What if every time he pressed the button, he was destabilizing something bigger than he understood? "I don't buy it," Lien said, but there was a flicker of doubt in his voice. He cleared his throat, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "So what are you gonna do? Destroy the lock? You think that'll solve everything?" "Yes," Chi said simply. "I have to. Before it's too late." Lien stared at the old man, his thoughts racing. He had never questioned the time lock's power before. He'd always seen it as a little convenience, nothing more than a way to catch his breath in a world that never slowed down. But Chi's warning was starting to echo in his mind. What if he had been wrong? What if the time lock wasn't just a personal tool, but a key to something much larger, something more dangerous? "You really think I'd let you destroy it?" Lien said, his voice low, almost challenging. "It's mine, Chi. I built it. You can't just come in here and take it down." Chi didn't flinch. "I have to, Lien. For both our sakes." Lien's heart was pounding now. He hadn't expected it to get this intense. The old man was serious, he wasn't going to back down. And that meant Lien had a choice to make. Was he willing to let go of something that had become such an integral part of his life? Was he ready to face whatever consequences there might be? For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to pause for just an instant, as if time itself was holding its breath. Finally, Lien made up his mind. His expression hardened, and he straightened his back, standing taller than before. "You think I'm wrong," Lien said, his voice steady. "But I don't think I am. And I'm not going to let you destroy it. Not without a fight." Chi nodded solemnly. "I knew you'd say that." With that, Chi raised his hands, muttering something under his breath, his eyes narrowing as a strange energy seemed to build around him. Lien's heart skipped a beat, realizing that Chi wasn't just talking. He was preparing to do something powerful. The air in the room seemed to thrum with electricity, a crackling tension that made the hairs on the back of Lien's neck stand up. "No!" Lien shouted, his fingers instinctively reaching for the time lock button on his desk. But Qi was too quick. Before Lien could press the button, the room seemed to twist. The light flickered, and the air grew heavy. Time itself felt warped. Lien's chest tightened as he felt an overwhelming force grip the room. It wasn't just the pause he'd come to expect from the time lock. This was something far more intense. Something that went deeper, that reached into the very fabric of time itself. Lien struggled, feeling the pressure of time pressing in on him, as if the universe were collapsing in on itself. It was like nothing he'd ever felt before. Qi's eyes glowed with an ancient power, and for a brief moment, Lien wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. "Stop!" Lien shouted, but his voice seemed to echo and vanish, lost in the swirling chaos of time. "I didn't know. I didn't mean for this to happen." But it was too late. Qi's spell, or whatever it was, had already taken hold. Time seemed to stretch and fold in on itself, the world blurring in a way that made Lien dizzy. He stumbled, trying to keep his balance, but everything around him was shifting, as if the very nature of reality were unraveling, and then, in the midst of the storm, Lien realized something that stopped him cold. This wasn't just about the time lock anymore. It wasn't just about his personal convenience or Qi's warnings. Something had gone wrong. Something that had been set into motion long before either of them had ever met. Qi had been right. Lien had been blind to the way time was intertwined, not just in his life, but in everything. The time lock had connected them. Not just as enemies, not just as old men with conflicting ideas. It had bound them together, inseparably, in ways neither of them understood. And if Qi destroyed the lock, if the balance of time was thrown off, would they both disappear? Would they both cease to exist in the process? Lien's heart raced as the realization hit him with full force. "Qi!" Lien shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "What have you done?" But Qi didn't respond. He stood there, eyes closed, seemingly lost in the ritual. Lien reached for him, but his hands slipped through the shifting air, as if reality itself were slipping through his fingers. Time had become a fluid thing, a thing that moved without regard for rules. It was as though they were both caught in a strange, unending loop, unable to escape the consequences of their actions, and then, with a sudden and jarring shift, it all stopped. The world around Lien went silent. No ticking clocks. No movement. No sound. Just an eerie stillness that stretched out in every direction. Lien blinked, disoriented, and found himself back in the shop. But it was different now. The air felt heavy, charged with the echoes of the moments that had just passed. He turned to look at Qi, but the old man was no longer standing there. Instead, Lien saw himself standing at the desk, pressing the button, locking time, and in that moment, Lien understood that he had never truly been in control of time. Time had always been the one in control. And now, the time lock, what he had made, was a part of him, a part of his own existence. They were bound together, like threads in the same tapestry, woven into the very fabric of the universe. And as the world began to reset around him, Lien realized the true cost of what he had done. Lien's heart thudded in his chest as he stared at his own reflection. The world was silent, suspended in time, but there was no denying the truth of what he saw. He was no longer in the shop the way he had been before. The edges of the room, the cluttered shelves, the dusty clocks, they all seemed strangely distant, as though they had slipped out of focus, fading into the ether of time itself. The moment he had pressed the button had changed everything, but now, in this eerie stillness, he couldn't make sense of what had happened. He stepped forward, still dizzy, his movements slow and hesitant. His reflection didn't move as he did. It stayed fixed, staring back at him with a vacant, glassy-eyed expression, like a figure trapped behind a sheet of glass. "What's happening?" Lien muttered under his breath. His voice, usually steady, trembled in the heavy silence. Then, without warning, a soft, almost imperceptible shift rippled through the air. Time, what was left of it, stirred. Lien turned, and to his shock, Chi appeared again, but this time he was different. He wasn't standing in the middle of the room like he had before. He was standing outside, looking in, like a ghostly projection, half-formed, flickering in and out of existence. Lien's breath caught in his throat. "Chi," he whispered. The figure that had once been so grounded, so real, seemed now to be slipping through the cracks of time itself. Chi's form flickered again, and his eyes, those ancient eyes that had always carried a sense of burden, met Lien's with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "You've done it now," Chi said, his voice a strange echo, as though it came from both far away and right next to Lien's ear. "We're caught." Lien reached out instinctively, but his hand passed right through Chi's form as if the old man were nothing more than a figment of the air. The disorientation was dizzying, but the weight of Chi's words sank in. "What do you mean, caught?" Lien asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What's happened? Where are we?" "I don't think either of us fully understands what you've done," Chi replied, his form wavering like a distorted image on a screen. "But I can feel it. We're stuck in between. Between moments. Between time." Lien's head spun. "Between time," he repeated. "How is that even possible?" "Because of the lock you've created," Chi explained, his voice growing more distant. "Every time you stopped time, every second you took for yourself, it created fractures. And now, they've caught us. We're not just in the pause anymore. We've become part of it. Part of the fabric you thought you were controlling." Lien's mind reeled. He thought about the power he had wielded, how simple it had seemed at first. Just a few seconds of respite. Just a brief break when the world grew too much to bear. But now, looking at Chi's flickering form, he understood the gravity of what he had done. He hadn't just pressed a button. He had altered the very course of time itself. "I didn't know," Lien said, his voice thick with disbelief. "I didn't know it could do this." "You never did," Chi said softly, though there was no anger in his tone. "You only saw the breaks as a way to rest, a way to escape. But you didn't see the cracks you were making. And now, those cracks are wider than you can imagine." Lien staggered back, his mind racing, the implications sinking deeper with each passing second. "What happens now? How do we fix it? Can we fix it?" Chi's form seemed to flicker again, his outline becoming more indistinct. "I don't know. Time is more delicate than you think. You may have paused it. You may have tried to lock it away. But you can't control it. No one can. Then what do we do?" Lien shouted, his frustration spilling over. "You said the lock was dangerous, and I've listened to you, but before Lien could finish his thought, the world around him shifted. A low, rumbling hum filled the air, like a storm on the horizon, and the edges of the room seemed to blur. The walls and the cluttered shelves began to warp and stretch, as if the very space around him were being pulled apart. Lien stumbled, reaching out for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing. Chi's form flickered again, but this time he was no longer alone. Figures appeared around Lien, ghostly images of people and moments he didn't recognize. They were all caught in the same disorienting swirl of distorted time, their faces empty, their eyes locked in the same frozen gaze as the reflection of Lien that still lingered in the corner of the room. "What are they?" Lien gasped, feeling the air grow thick with their presence. "They're echoes," Chi answered, his voice barely audible over the rising hum. "Fragments of the moments you've paused. They're the backlog of time you've interrupted. They're trapped here, just like us." Lien watched in horror as the figures began to stretch, their limbs elongating and distorting in impossible shapes, as if they were nothing more than smears on the canvas of time. Their faces, once clear, now became blurry, disfigured by the very force that held them in place. The air grew colder, heavier, and the echoes seemed to multiply, until the room was filled with countless versions of the same image, faces and bodies trapped in different moments, repeating the same actions over and over again. "It's too much," Lien said, his voice tight with panic. "What's going to happen to us?" "Time is trying to correct itself," Chi said, his form now barely visible. "These echoes, they're the results of the imbalance you created. And if we don't fix it, if we don't reset it," but before Chi could finish his sentence, a sudden surge of energy rippled through the room. The echoes shrieked in a cacophony of distorted voices, and the space around Lien stretched even further, warping beyond recognition. Lien's head swam as everything around him seemed to collapse in on itself. He could feel his mind reeling, pulled in every direction, like a thread being tugged on both ends by an unseen hand. Then, everything stopped, for one moment, one single, eternal moment. The chaos ceased. The hum of distorted time vanished, the echoes silenced, and Lien found himself standing in the middle of the room once more, the cluttered shop around him now looking normal. No more warping, no more fractures. Just silence. Lien gasped for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. What had happened? Was it over? Did the world reset itself? Was he free from the nightmare of fractured time? He turned to look at Chi, but the old man was gone. There was no trace of him, no form flickering in the distance. The room was empty, save for Lien and the weight of what he had done. He was alone in the stillness. The silence stretched on, and for the first time, Lien felt the full weight of the decision he had made. He had locked time. He had tried to control it. And in doing so, he had lost everything: his control, his peace, and even his sense of reality. Time was not his to command. Lien looked around the room, his eyes falling on the small button hidden beneath his desk, the button he had used so many times to pause the world, to take his break. But now, it felt like a distant memory. A forgotten tool. A failed attempt at controlling the uncontrollable. In that moment, Lien knew. The time lock had to go. It was the only way to set things right.